Hi, everybody. Hope everybody's doing well. Um, this is a video presentation that I'm presenting to you guys because unfortunately I can't be at the symposium today. And the reason for that is that I'm not right this moment there, as you can see, but at the time you're watching this, I'm at a Qigong retreat with a teacher of mine in New Zealand. And it's part of a 2-week training I do once a year. It's part of an ongoing training in Qigong techniques. And so that's where I am right now. And I'm going to talk more about that actually a little bit later. But I also wanted to just preface this by saying that in some respects, I find myself more nervous about giving a video presentation rather than a presentation in person for a variety of reasons, some of which you can maybe surmise. But one that sticks out for me is just that the thought for me of watching some guy on YouTube talk for 20 minutes, it sounds like some small version of hell. So if you're experiencing that, I get it, and I will not take it personally. And at the same time, I'll try to make this interesting and engaging uh, with the subject matter that we're talking about. So first, just as a brief overview, I just wanted to kind of explain what I'm going to be talking about here. And it comes in a few stages. So first, I just wanted to take a few minutes to chime in with my 2 cents on our readings and kind of the general contours of our debate for today between perennialism and participatory thought. And so I'll spend a few minutes doing that. And from there, I also want to dive into a question of somatics and notion of getting out of the head, and which, in our intellectual work, we can sometimes get quite heady. And so building upon some of the stuff we've talked about in class with regards to that subject, I want to bring forward some conceptions of mind-body unity. I'll just be talking briefly about Dan Siegel, who's a MD who coined and started a system called MindSight. He also contributed to the founding of interpersonal neurobiology, which is an interesting emerging field. And I'll also be bringing forward, for your consideration, some of the theories that underlie what I'm learning at this Qigong retreat, which generally speaking could be put under the title of Qi and consciousness theory, with Qi being sort of a universal life force or energy that comprises everything in the universe. And so let me just check my notes here. So I'm going to dive into that, and then I'm also going to then give a viewpoint on what I'm doing for my final research paper and try to ground that within the contours of our debate, particularly the participatory perspective. So I'll be talking about my research into the placebo effect and research that's been going on in recent years to try to understand the underlying mechanisms of the placebo effect in scientific and the medical communities. So I'll be speaking to that and also name some of the underlying things that I feel like it's uncovered. And if we have time, lastly, I'd like to invite us all into an embodied experiment, an exercise, something that I call Qi healing, which is also based in the system that I'm learning right now, and will build upon what we talk about here. So that's that. And so for starters, I wanted to just kind of chime in with my 2 cents about the participatory perennial conversation that we're having. And to do that, to begin with, I wanted to locate myself as a few things. I guess, firstly, I want to locate myself as someone who comes from a cultural context where the participatory viewpoint is quite valued. I grew up in Berkeley, right across the bay from San Francisco, and I grew up in a context that was very liberal, very pluralistic, very interested in the democratization of all sorts of different things, whether it was deconstructing patriarchy from a feminism perspective or advocating for the rights of minorities through social justice issues. And so I think that because I'm a product and part of my cultural context, I think I'm naturally sympathetic to the participatory view. And I also want to contextualize that I'm a student at CIIS, where the two of the main champions of the participatory framework are on faculty, and one of them is teaching our class. And I'm also enrolled in the department that Jorge teaches in. And so I think that's also worth noting as potentially skewing or just locating particularly where my viewpoint is coming from. And I also want to name that I wouldn't be surprised if in our group the emerging consensus ultimately kind of comes around the participatory viewpoint. And while I think that that may be great, I think it's just also important based upon kind of the values and ethics that participatory turn elicits for us to be conscious and aware of where that insight might be arising from. So that said, I really enjoyed doing these readings, and I guess first of all, I want to say that before I critique him, that I want to be kind to Ken Wilber, and I want to appreciate a lot of what he's done and what his work has accomplished. And part of that involves historically contextualizing his work. And I think it's just important to remember that when Ken Wilber originally started working, conceptions of spirituality were largely missing from most mainstream academic and scholarly circles. And so I really see his work as this valuable attempt to reintegrate and reintroduce some of those conceptions and find a synthesis between that and the prevailing zeitgeist. And in that regard, I think that he's contributed a lot to the conversation and forwarded something. And at the same time, I have to say that my experience of Ken Wilber is kind of like that he's the last, or at least the current last, great giant of egotistical confusion. And I think that that is reflected not necessarily, I mean, it's pervasive throughout what he says, but it's also the manner in which he says it and the way in which his system, his theory, and his research kind of unfolds. And the main thing about that is that I just see Ken Wilber as being very isolated and very alone. And I think that those are things that ultimately hinder the value of his system. And by contrast, we have Jorge and Glenn as well, who are kind of like positioned in this conversation as like men of the masses, with the people, and I think that also reflects the underlying value in being able to dialogue and connect with other people, uh, and how that relational dynamic allows new ideas to emerge and allows a real consensus, a genuine sense that people can come to, that they are part of something, that they have a place in this whole system, which regardless of whether, 60% or 50% or whatever we say of Ken Wilber's theory is valid, I think that a lot of people just don't find him compelling as an individual and don't feel respected by his viewpoint. And that kind of brings up questions of values and qualities, which is something I'm going to touch on when I talk about the placebo effect. But before I get there, I want to just touch in also about what I feel is also characteristic of this debate, which is a certain headiness And I say that with love and appreciation for it also, because scholarship requires intellectual rigor and critique. Um, and at the same time, I think that most of us would agree that, academic inquiry can often become very cerebral, very intellectual. And within that, some of the most promising things that I find most exciting about uh, what we're studying in class and advances in the times that we're in is this process of getting out of the head and into an embodied experience from which then data and reflection, new ideas can emerge. And so on that point, I wanted to bring forward a definition of mind that I came across by Dan Siegel, who I mentioned before, um, just because I thought it was very, very interesting. So Dan Siegel, he defines the mind as a relational and embodied process that regulates the flow of energy and information. And I found this interesting, in part because I really resonated with it. I thought that, wow, this is a definition that really encapsulates a lot of the issues we're discussing in class, the need for a relational element, the need for an embodied element, the fact that mind or consciousness experience is a process and not a static thing, and that it's basically in a completely integrated relationship with what's called here the flow of energy and information, which is, kind of a scientifically rigorous way of saying life. Um, and so, yeah, a relational and embodied experience process that regulates the flow of energy and information. One thing I found interesting and compelling about that definition is it really dovetails with the conceptions of consciousness that we utilize here in Ren Shui at the retreat I'm at. And within that, we have this notion of qi and consciousness theory. And so, without getting too much into all the details of it, I just want to bring it forward because I feel like it essentially posits what Glenn was speaking to in quoting Richard Tarnas about this kind of unity of mind and matter, and that actually it's not just our brains that are conscious, or even our bodies, or even life, as in living beings and systems, but actually that the entire physical reality, physical dimension is also imbued with a conscious element and is itself in some way conscious. And this is articulated in this system through the viewpoint that chi, which is energy, and consciousness, which is information, the mind, are essentially and ultimately one, or different aspects of the same thing, and that they kind of participate in this more field theory that there's a fabric that's unbroken and is full of all sorts of variation and differences, where mind and matter are one. So bring that forward. Hopefully, we'll get to explore it a little bit, but I wanted to bring it forward also in the context of my research project. And my research project is into the placebo effect. And so, the placebo effect, as I'm sure you guys are all familiar with in just kind of popular terms, is this sense that this thing that happens in research and also in medical healing setting, where a pill or also like a piece of information could be given over to a patient or a research participant that doesn't actually have any inherent healing qualities in it, in the sense that it doesn't have a physical mechanism that is creating some sort of healing, but that nonetheless the subject who receives that pill or information has a subjective change in their state of being and actually experiences improvement. Um, so this has confounded researchers for a long time. The placebo effect's been known about for most of the 20th century, and it's something that needs to be controlled for when they're doing research, for example, into like a new drug. You need to be able to demonstrate that the drug actually provides results that exceed the placebo effect. And what's remarkable is that the placebo effect is actually quite significant. So much so that actually in the last 20 years or so, there's been a huge surge in research trying to understand the placebo effect itself and what is causing it. Out of this, um, there's been a clear demonstration that the effects of our mind or our expectations or a variety of other subjective based phenomena actually affect our experience, um, and play a significant role both in research and clinical practice, and I would say, in our life. And so within that, we have this kind of question about like what does that come from, and how can we address that? And hang on one second, just gonna